of what's happened this year with Evan?
Yep,
thanks.
Absolutely. I'll just do a very quick, fairly short presentation on Evan, just to introduce the network to people who may not be familiar with it, and let you know a little bit about what we've been doing over the past 12 months or so, and invite you to get involved if you'd like to. So the purpose of the network is to sustainably enable stronger connections between environmental volunteers, groups, agencies and community to achieve our shared goal of caring for nature. So the intent is really to foster those the connections between the work that people are doing to help share information, network, provide opportunities for reciprocal engagement, such as the opportunity to hear about the work that various agencies and community groups are doing, which is what we'll be sharing tonight through Irina's presentation about the Enfield Grevillea and the work that she's doing with DELP. And it wouldn't be an Evan presentation without sharing the Evan collaboration tree, which is the way we kind of share the activities that we've developed collectively last year when we did some planning with groups and agencies together about the kinds of activities that we could do for this year, 2021. And so they're all kind of laid out in the foliage up in the canopy, but all of that is enabled by the energy that people who care for nature bring. So we recognise that those people are in many different, they can be in groups, they might be acting as individual volunteers, they're in agency, they're in Indigenous groups, they're just general interested community, education, business, agriculture, you name it, there's people who care for nature everywhere. So it's really about helping to draw on those mutual interests and utilise the strengths of each toward this shared goal, caring for nature. So we're formed from some work that happened in 2020. 2021 is really where we're sort of starting to develop some activities and work out how we're collaborating together. And then we're looking forward into the future to just strengthening that and continuing that work and acting in this space to help strengthen the connections and the good work that people are doing across the Central West area. So the 10 actions that we identified in November last year are laid out here. So we've been doing some forums. We held a Meet Your Land Manager session, which ran over 4 lunchtimes in April earlier this year, which was a great way for people to hear about the work that different agencies were doing. So some projects, some was focused on grants, some was in particular landscapes, it was local government, CMA, Department of Environment, climate change, all sorts of things. And those recordings are available on the Swift webpage. And then the second forums that we ran were more community focused. So Caring for Nature Community College, where we had 3 different groups presenting in a session across 3 sessions in different time slots to make it flexible for people who worked or didn't work or preferred to do things on a weekend or an evening to be able to access those. And they're all available on the Swift website too. So there's some really great information and sort of sharing lessons and learning from each other through that. We weren't able to do place-based visits for obvious reasons, but we're hoping that we'll be able to do that in future. Develop some great resources, and a number of these things are things that we may have sort of commenced work on, like training for groups this year, and we'll continue that into the next year as well. So we're hoping to do, more community events and more face-to-face networking and focus on opportunities for getting younger people involved in volunteering as well, because we feel like that's a space where we can lend some help to leverage groups who might have projects that are suitable for tertiary students and be that connecting point to help connect student groups and environmental course coordinators to help share those opportunities and get them to a wider network and try and encourage young people to participate and take up those opportunities, which obviously helps their career and helps to nurture their interest in the environmental field. So all about the up and coming generations of nature carers. And the coordinator role to facilitate collaboration is something that we feel is quite central, and we're hoping to have some more good news about that to share early in the new year. And if you're looking for those presentations, they're on the Swift webpage, as I mentioned, and you can find Evan under the teams and projects and we've got our own activities and events that are on there. So we don't have our own website at this stage. That's something we might do in future. But if you're looking for us, you can find us on Swift, and you can also connect with us. We've just got a Facebook group up and running, which is another way of sharing the activities, the work, celebrating the groups, helping to foster those connections, sharing news from the agencies and so on, that we will be able to build and grow as we move into the future. And we have email. If you guys ever have any questions, want to get in touch, share news, feel free to get in touch with us that way. The monthly networking is something that's happened over the course of this year, and every fourth Tuesday you can jump online. Very informal, there's no agenda, and it's just an opportunity to connect and share information and have a good chat, or find out what news is going on, or ask a question if you're needing some advice or some assistance with anything. And we don't have a regular bulletin, but there is a bulletin that comes out from time to time, and we'll have a final one coming out mid-December this year, which will contain some news, a bit of an update about tonight, and most of what I've shared, and a bit of an update on Evan's work for this year. So that's it for me, and looking forward to Irina's presentation, and thanks for being with us tonight. And if you'd like to, if you do have any news, or even just to share which group you're part of and you want to share that in the chat, feel free to throw that in too, and so we can kind of find out who's in the room with us and get to know each other a little bit as well, even though we're in this online space. So thanks. Hope you enjoy the evening.
Yeah.
And
Thanks.
I will stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Cherie. So yes, those that have arrived since I said welcome to you all to this event. It emerged out of one of Evan's goals, which is to basically share information, to provide opportunities where agencies, community groups and people can share good news stories, so we can hear what each other are doing, rather than being sort of locked away in our own little reserve or parcel of land that we look after, that we have a forum or a format for hearing what other people are doing, connecting with their achievements, with their failures, with their trials, with their resources, their opportunities, how they've moved forward through the various obstacles and hurdles that they might have faced. So we just wanted to reach out to that community, volunteers across Victoria, and particularly in the Central West. And what came up a few weeks ago was an invitation from Irina to the Field Nets to become involved in the study that they're developing on the Enfield group. And one thing led to another, and we decided last week to put wheels on it, give Irina a chance to share her story, share her research project, and basically for us as volunteers and other agencies to hear what's happening, a good news story with the Vegetation, which grows just across there. So I live in the Enfield Grevillea area, and that's a beautiful plant. So Irina, I'd like to hand to you. Welcome. I won't steal any more of your time. Go for it.
Thanks for the introduction, Peter. So I'll just start sharing my screen. Just give me a thumbs up when everyone can see that.
Not yet.
Yes.
Yes.
Not yet? Okay.
There it is. Good.
Okay. It's just a little bit delayed. So that's good.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, so as Peter mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about the Enfield Grevillea project in specifically, but also a bit about the work that I do at DELP and where this project came from. So as Peter mentioned before, I just wanted to start the presentation by showing respect to the traditional owners on all the lands in which we are meeting here today. For me, that's the Watchabaluk country up in northwestern Victoria, the lands of the Wagaya, Watchabaluk, Jadwa, Jadwajali and Japagaluk people. And I'd also like to extend my acknowledgement to the Wadawurrung people whose land in which this research project will be taking place, and to any people of traditional owner identification who may be meeting with us today on the call. So I'd also like to thank Evan in particular for the group inviting me to come along and talk about this work as well. So it's great to be here and to see a number of people joining us tonight. So I'm the Biodiversity Officer in the Grampians Risk and Evaluation team as part of the Forest Fire Operations Division in DELP. So that's a big mouthful in a description of what I do, but in summary, most of what my work entails around is our strategic bushfire management planning process. So I've just got a screenshot here on the slides of a document that was produced in collaboration with a number of people in the department and across with other agencies around our bushfire management strategy and planning process. And this is the Grampians Bushfire Management Strategy that was released at the end of last year. So in there, we've outlined a lot of large, broad strategic goals and objectives of how we want to improve the work that we do on public land for managing bushfire risk and the impacts to other values in the community. So for me, a lot of my work is focused around down the bottom here where we've highlighted the regional values and objectives. As Biodiversity Officer, I focus mostly on natural values and this main objective of maximising persistence of ecological communities and species. So that document is available online and I can share links to it if anybody wants to read it in more depth. It is a large 70 or 80 page document, I think, and we also have a bit more of a simplified story map if people want to go into a bit more detail about the bushfire management strategy and the different values that are in that process. But so my work is about translating this strategic management planning process down through the different levels that we work across in the agency, from operational planning to tactical planning. So the strategic planning is very high level, long-term timeframes of 10 to 40 years. Operational is shorter timeframes. For example, a joint field management program, which is a 1 to 3 year planning process that covers how we want to do burning in shorter intervals. And then our tactical planning is the much shorter timeframes of essentially month to month or day to day in relation to specific activities that we do. So my work is about ensuring that we continue to include this objective of persistence of ecological communities and species all the way through our different planning processes in the department. So going into a bit more detail about these objectives, there's quite a number of them that have been outlined. This is specifically around our natural values, and I've just highlighted some of the ones here in green that are specifically relevant to the project that I'll be talking about today. So in particular, the long-term outcomes for our bushfire management planning process is that we want to ensure the persistence of threatened, rare and endemic species. And in the short term, we want to ensure that the impact of our planned burning on threatened species such as the Enfield Grevillea is minimised, and that we put in place appropriate mitigation measures. So, again, my work is very broad, high level. I work across the whole region, and you can see on the map, this is a representation of the region, which covers all the way from Bacchus Marsh near Melbourne up to the border of South Australia, so around Little Desert, West Rimmer area. And this is a really broad landscape with a number of different values across the entire landscape, and that really varies quite diversely across the whole region. So part of what we're also looking at in the department is breaking this down into sub-landscapes so that we can come up with more detailed plans about how we want to do this management process and provide greater value and input into the work that we do that's more relevant at a local scale. So in each of these sub-landscapes, you can see they've been divided into a number of different colour classifications here, just as an example. And in each of these, we've identified a number of threatened species that are important to us when we go to do biodiversity and ecological management works in the area, and to understand the impact of our fire management process to these species. Sorry, I've just got a bit of feedback there. So in each of these sub-landscapes, as I mentioned, there's a number of threatened species that we're concerned about when we do our fire management process, but also a lot of these threatened species, very little is known about how they respond to fire. So when we're going to do our planned burning or any of our fuel management processes and works, there's a number of assumptions that are made about the species. So we want to improve our understanding for a variety of these species all across the landscape. As an example, one of the first species we're focusing on is the Enfield Grevillea, which I'll be speaking about tonight. So the Enfield sub-landscape is this one down here that is highlighted in orange. And if I just click to the next slide, this is a zoomed in version of that Enfield area. So it's just south of Ballarat, and the blue is an outline of that sub-landscape area of where we're hoping to develop some comprehensive planning information for, and in brown this is the public land estate. So a large majority of the area is private land, but in this public land covers quite a lot of different reserves and estate across the whole area. So the majority of it is here in the state park and state forest. So in this area, this is where the Enfield Grevillea study area will be, this area highlighted in purple. So if I zoom in a bit, this is just a focused look on the large majority of the public land in the Enfield sub-landscape area. And the dots here highlighted in blue, this is a record of where the Enfield Grevillea species has been found in the area. So it's very much localized just to this large patch of vegetation. It's not found anywhere else in the Enfield sub-landscape area or anywhere else in the state of the world. So it's very localized in this area, and these dot points is just the known records of where the species has been found historically and to date. So it's not necessarily a strong representation of exactly where the species is present. Some of them might be historical and maybe the species isn't there anymore, maybe it's been mapped incorrectly and GPS information has changed. So a lot of these outliers, as you can see, that are a bit further away from the majority of the species, they might be historical and not necessarily present there anymore. So if we did zoom into this map a bit further, you'd probably also see these identification points are heavily associated with roads. So there has been some speculation that maybe the species prefers the disturbance of being along roads, but we don't know for sure about that. And as I mentioned, there's quite a lot of information on the species that's very well unknown. So we might also find that the location of these species in association to roads is likely associated with a survey bias rather than a species preference. So this is something that we want to investigate more to get a better understanding of what the species actually requires. But that is out of scope of the project that we're looking at today, but it's just another thing to take into consideration for the species. So zooming in on the monitoring site that I mentioned before, this is a planned burn area that will be delivered next year in 2022. And we've identified a couple of monitoring plots within that burn area that we want to go through and conduct our study. So in the previous map, when it had all of the blue dots, a lot of those in this area are associated with Halls Road and Misery Creek Road. These are the main roads in the area. There's also a couple internal access tracks that aren't very accessible. So a lot of these sites that I've identified for monitoring have never been identified before. So this is a new record for the species, which is quite good to see. And in this map is more of a a satellite imagery. You can see the topography a bit better in the landscape just by looking at this. And all of the sites that we've identified, coincidentally, follows the same aspect. They're all heavily associated with northeastern areas. This isn't intentional, but that's where the species tends to be found. So it does make it a little bit easier for us doing the monitoring to keep these sort of things consistent. And anecdotally, just doing my own non-scientific surveys, trying to look for monitoring sites, I did find quite a number all along these ridge lines. So it would be interesting to know how much more of the species might be recorded in internal areas that aren't associated with tracks. So just flicking to habitat for the species, which I sort of discussed, this is a picture of a roadside population of the species. My apologies for the awkward angle. I think I took it a little bit too artistically and I've had to rotate it to make it easier to visualize. So this is Misery Creek Road, just here on the side, and on this embankment is a pretty good population of Enfield Grevillea. You can see it here in the foreground. It's just sort of growing down the embankment as a sort of prostrate ground cover type plant. And once you get your eye on, it's a bit easier to spot, but it might be a little bit elusive at first. But you can see it kind of sprinkled across here. It's the sort of bright green coloured leaves in the landscape. So on a lot of roadsides, this is quite common. You see it in patches like this, usually also associated with aspect. This is another picture of the habitat that the species does grow in as well. So you can see this is quite different. This is more of a woody area. It's not quite as open and sunny. It's not as highly disturbed. It's off the track a little bit more, but it's still just as prominent here. So this is probably another example that it's not quite as fussy about disturbance being important for it, but we don't know that for sure. This is just anecdotal based on a number of experiences of people out in the bush doing different kinds of research. But that's another thing that probably needs to be looked into a bit more to determine what the preference is for this species in location. So all of the sites that I showed before on the map, they're all more like this rather than the road ones. So they're off the road, disturbance is limited, and we can get a better idea of the impact of natural environmental factors such as fire without having the impact from disturbance from vehicles and people. So this is a better, closer up view of the actual Enfield Grevillea species to give you more of an idea of what it looks like. This is quite a large plant. You can see it grows pretty flat across the ground, quite prostrate, and covers most things sort of in its path. You can often see it growing over the top of other shrubs or grasses or something like that, which makes it look a little bit taller than it actually is. But yeah, it tends to grow as a trailing plant rather than a large shrub. Although there again has been some anecdotal suggestions from people that in some occasions it might grow into a larger plant. But in general, this is a good representation of the plant. This one is probably 1 to 2 meters in size, so it's quite big. And again, we don't know a lot about the species. We don't know how long it takes for the species to get to this size. Once it reaches this size, how reproductively mature is it? And what's the likelihood that new seedlings are going to germinate around it? And in a post-fire environment, how long would it take for a plant that has been burnt like this to come back to a similar size or to come back to a size that is sufficiently healthy again to continue the persistence of the species? Also, from this picture, this looks like it's one plant, but it could also be 2 or 3 plants growing really close together. So this is something we're going to have to dig into when we go to do the monitoring work, is to figure out what's one large plant versus a number of smaller plants. So just here, this is a picture of the underneath side of the leaves, and there's many other species that have similar growing habits like this, of in particular Grevillea species, and several of them will also produce roots that go underground and then pop up as new plants that look like new seedlings, but they're genetically identical to the mother plant. Whereas from anecdotal experiences from other people who've done work with the species, it's generally believed that that isn't the case for this plant. So we think it will be a fair bit easier when we go to do the monitoring work, that we're able to identify which plant is which, and we can therefore tag them, come back and monitoring, and get a clearer idea of how individual plants are responding over time. This is a better look at some of the flowers and the leaves of the plant. So you can see the leaves are very bright green. When you look at it, when you look at the plant from a distance, it really stands out because it's a much brighter green than a lot of the other dull coloured plants in the area. And it has the standard Grevillea inflorescence. In these pictures, you can see the cluster of flowers, and it'll start to mature the different individual flowers over time. So the top flowers will be more mature than the ones down the bottom. And as the flowers begin to mature, they'll also start to change colour. So they start off green and they'll eventually turn to a red colour over time as well. So again, there's not a lot known about the process of this flowering, and likely how long it takes to produce seeds, or the number of seeds that will be developed per flower and that sort of thing. There are some people who are doing a bit of research around that, so it'll be interesting to get some more information, and part of that will also be incorporated in some of the information that we're doing. There's also some suggestions that potentially this different colour changes from yellow to green could be associated with the plant attracting different pollinators at different stages of the flowering process that might increase its pollination rate. But again, that's something that needs to be investigated in more details to get a better understanding for the species. So just going back to our bushfire management planning process and why we're going into more detail about this study. These are bushfire management zones that have been identified in our bushfire management strategy. So these bushfire zones identify different periods of frequencies in which we might conduct planned burning in the landscape. So you can see in red, for example, just down here, this is an asset protection zone that is usually located quite close to residential properties and is considered high risk in the landscape. And this is where we want to prioritise risk to life and property. We also do consider ecological values in part of this process, but our number one priority is to manage fuels for reduction of risk to life and property. Adjacent to that, you can see a bushfire management zone, a bushfire moderation zone, sorry, and these are areas where there's a associated close to asset protection zones, so there's still a certain level of risk in the landscape that needs to be managed by the departments, but we could also take into account a greater balance between risk to life and property and ecological values. And then there's also the landscape management zones, which are a bit further away from residential housing. And again, there's greater consideration for ecological values in those areas. So the main difference between these zones is the frequency that we do burning. And in asset protection zones, we've outlined in our strategic plan that burning will occur in frequencies of between 5 to 8 years. In bushfire moderation zone, it's 8 to 15 years, and in landscape management zones, it's intervals that are usually larger than that, but can vary depending on requirements in our planning process. So going into a bit more detail about the ecological values and how we incorporate them in our planning process, this is a map of the ecological vegetation communities in the area, and a way that we use to define vegetation types. This is something that many people are probably quite familiar with. They're very detailed and comprehensive and have been mapped vegetation communities in association to particular characteristics such as species and structure and different ecological niches that are required for those vegetation communities. There's I think over 300 of them across the state, so there's a lot of them and there's a lot of detail involved in that, but it makes it a bit difficult for our fire management processes. So in our fire management planning processes, we've incorporated these into development of what we call ecological fire groups. So this is usually an amalgamation of different ecological vegetation classification groups based together in association with their fire response characteristics. So, for example, a number of EVCs may amalgamate into a single EFG, but each EFG might have a different number of EVCs that feed into it. And there's usually key fire response species that are associated with these ecological fire groups that are used to develop tolerable fire intervals, so the minimum and maximum amount of time that these vegetation groups can go with either having fire or going without fire. So just looking at the same map that I showed before, this is it in an EFG form. So you can see there's a reduced number of vegetation groups through the EFG mapping process, and most of those that have been amalgamated were sort of grassy woodlands, grassy forests, heathy dry forests, and they've all become this grassy heathy dry forest. This is all part of the area that the monitoring project will be conducted in as well, just under here. So most of the area, this EFG is relevant for it as well. This process of developing ecological fire groups and tolerable fire intervals was done as part of a major project back in 2010 by David Teal. He wrote a very good and comprehensive report on this. It's about 250 pages. If anyone is interested in reading it, it is available on the internet, and I can provide a copy of that as well. So in this document, Jill has set out tolerable fire intervals for those vegetation groups. And for the Enfield area, we've identified the grassy heathy dry forest as the vegetation community that impacts the majority of it, and that is where the Enfield Grevillea is found. And in this tolerable fire interval, it outlines the maximum number of years that the vegetation community is expected to go as it goes through different stages of reproductive maturity and may then start to decline into a stage of senescence or renewal in a post-fire period. So for grassy heathy dry forest, that's 45 years, but for other vegetations communities that aren't as dry, such as tall mist forest, that's 300 years. So there's a big difference between the different ways the vegetation communities will respond to fire. For the minimum tolerable fire interval, this is the minimum number of years that we would want to have fire in the landscape before we have concerns about how the vegetation communities may be able to persist long term. So for a grassy heathy dry forest, for a high severity fire, that's 15 years, and low severity, that's 10 years. So very crude example here is that a planned burn might be considered a low severity fire, whereas a bushfire is more likely to be considered a high severity fire. And that's not a hard and fast rule, but they're just some examples to contextualize it for you. So as I mentioned before, we don't know very much about the fire response of the Enfield Grevillea, so we use these tolerable fire intervals to set mitigation measures around how we expect a species might respond to fire. So the threatened species of Enfield Grevillea, we're concerned we don't know what the fire impact might be, so we are going to take a precautionary approach that fire may be negative for the species and use these tolerable fire intervals as a way of determining that. And so if we're going to use these, we want to make sure that we're going to be able to make more specific decisions when we get more information about the species. And that's the intent of this project, is to get more of that information, and we can move away from this broader classification that doesn't take into account this individual species and is just looking at the high level community level. The mitigation measures that we might put in place for a species like Enfield Grevillea is that, for example, if we were going to do a planned burn in our asset protection zone or our bushfire moderation zone, which may be less than the 10-year fire interval that we've identified as concern for the species, then we'll put in mitigation measures to protect that species, which will be usually protecting an area such as removing fuel from around the plant, or putting in wet lines, which is basically a sprinkler system that will dampen the vegetation and reduce the likelihood of that fuel catching. And it's not a guarantee. We can't guarantee that there's not going to be any impact from fire, but it will reduce the likelihood that a patch of certain species is going to be impacted by that planned burning. But again, those sort of mitigation measures, they come with their own level of disturbance. We are going into the bush and removing fuels and having some sort of impact that wouldn't occur if we weren't going to put those mitigation measures. We also have to take into account the safety of crews that will be out in the field conducting the burns, for example, hazardous trees or things like that. So there's a lot more safety considerations and concerns that we need to take in place. So if we're going to do mitigation measures, we want to make sure that they're important, that they're required, and that they're relevant, and that they're going to make the impact that we intend them to make. For example, Enfield Grevillea, it might respond well to fire, and if we're putting in these mitigation measures, they might cause more of an impact to other species in the area than what the fire would do on itself. So we want to be able to get more information when we're making decisions about doing these mitigation measures, to make sure that they're appropriate, and if they are required, that they're making enough of an impact that we expect from them. So going into more detail about the actual project itself, the questions we're looking at answering through this project is what proportion of plants are killed by fire, the Enfield Grevillea plants that is, and what the relative proportions of those plants resprouting or the seedling recruitments following fire. How many years after fire do the recruits and resprouts reach reproductive maturity? And are their mortality rates higher for smaller or younger plants? And is there vulnerability to the exposure to heat from a fire that is of concern? So the actual project methods that we're using will be before and after control impact design. As I showed before in the monitoring plot, there's 4 separate sites. Each of those sites have 2 plots in them, and one of those plots will be a control and one will be a burn. So one, we will implement the mitigation measures to protect the species, and the other one we will allow a planned burn to go through as it normally would in other areas. And we'll come back and monitor both of those plots to see what the variation and difference is between those 2 plots. And having a control is really important, because we can say that whatever impact the burn has had, it is directly associated with the burn, rather than a natural occurrence that might just happen anyway. For example, the background motility rate or seed germination that might just happen naturally out in the environment. So each of these plots is about 10 to 20 metres wide and will contain approximately 30 plants. We're going to go through and mark each individual plant and go through and put some very detailed measurements about the size of the plants, for example, the length of the stems, the number of stems. If the plant is reproductively mature, for example, it has flowers, how many of those flowers are producing seed pods, and how many seed pods are on a plant, for example, to give us an idea of what happens before the fire. We're also going to take some photo points so that we can see the landscape variation of change over time when we go back to do monitoring. After the burn, we'll come back and we'll do all of these the same measures we did pre-burn, and we'll also look at the motility and resprouting, so that we can, as I mentioned before, compare between the control and the unburnt site to see if there's a greater number of plants that might die after fire, or a greater number of plants that might germinate after fire. So if, for example, the species is a resprouting species, so that's something that we don't know about the species either, is whether it's an obligate seeder or a resprouter, so whether it dies back after fire and relies on new seeds to germinate and repopulate the population, or whether it remains dormant underground as a lignotuber or something like that and resprouts after the fire. So at the moment, the project is only looking at the burn from before and after, but we're also hoping that we'll be able to come back over longer terms, such as 2 to 5 years, to look at the long-term response post-fire. So this is specifically looking at the immediate fire response, and will also help us to inform that longer-term fire response for this species and come up with specific tolerable fire intervals for this threatened species. So as I mentioned, so far we've been in the planning process for this project, but we're just about to start going ahead to do the implementation process. So that'll be going out to do monitoring of the pre-burn data. So the burn won't go ahead until next year, but we're going out next week to do the monitoring work to collect all that data. So that'll be from Tuesday to Friday next week. I've got some dates and times in there. If anyone is interested or available, there's an opportunity to come and join us on the project. I've got my contact details down the bottom if anyone wants to contact me directly, and I think they were also provided as part of promotion of this event. So there's opportunities if anybody wants to get in contact and participate in the event. We are always happy and welcome to have people come and be involved in this. Also, just to mention that due to government protocols, we will need to cite proof of vaccination or medical exemptions for anybody that's participating in the program, in the project, just as part of our health and safety requirements for everybody that's involved. So that was a semi-brief / comprehensive summary of the project and some of the work that we do at DELP. And if anyone has any questions or comments, I'm quite happy to talk and have a chat about them.
Thanks, Serena. That was really interesting. Look, I might kick off with a question. Given that so little is known about the Grevillea, where is there going to be a repository for all the information you gather that other people can start adding their information, whether it's anecdotal or whether it's citizen science, so that there's one place that all the information that is known about the Grevillea, like pollinators, the growth rate, you know, those sorts of things. Is there a place that you're going to be keeping this information that becomes sort of receptive to other information that's developed over the years about the Grevillea?
Yeah, so as part of all of our process, will we be doing our standard reporting and putting any of that, as I mentioned, into our management plans, which should all be publicly available at some point. But also we're hoping that this work will feed into public knowledge and research knowledge about the species as it would through any other research institution. So ideally, if there's any information that we find, it will be published, and that we will also upload it to places like iNaturalist, the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, and the Atlas of Living Australia. So new points where we found the species, or any information that we can provide about how it responds to fire. We want that to be public knowledge. And as I mentioned, there's so many questions about this individual species that aren't in the scope of the work that I do, but many other people might be interested in. For example, I mentioned about the pollinators and the genetics. La Trobe Uni have done a lot of work from that, and they've been involved helping us to get a better understanding about the species. So we want to continue that collaboration process, that our information is going to be useful to people going forward in whatever kind of research they can be doing around ecological values, or specifically this species.
Thanks. Yeah. Any other questions from anyone? Cherie.
Yeah, a little bit similar to yours actually, Peter. As Irina was talking through various aspects of the Grevillea, I was wondering about what's known about its growth, like where the seed is being collected and growth rates in not in a field are known, like the germination requirements and that sort of more horticultural knowledge, I guess, about reproduction and whether that's being studied. And alternatively, or the field side of things and the faunal kind of associations as well, and whether that's or how that is being understood and taken into account with the fire regimes too.
Yeah, so they're all things that we're very interested in as well. There's not any work that I'm aware of right now that is going on around that. I know there are various people from different academic levels who might be interested in taking up some of that work soon. And again, we're looking at just the immediate fire response. It's a very small study into the breadth of what could be known about this species. But if any other information comes along even after we've done this project, we want to make sure that we're up to date with that and including that in our decision making processes. So it's not like we do this research project and then we walk away and say we've learned enough. We're always going to be continuing to expand our knowledge and keep an eye on what other research other people are doing.
Just by way of interest, one of the field naturalists, who I won't name, many years ago took home a cutting from the forest and planted it in the garden, and it's absolutely taken off. It is enormous, and she can't prune it back hard enough. It grows so rapidly, so rampantly, and it's really interesting because just across in our bush here we have an Enfield Grevillea that's probably 4 metres in girth across from one side to the other, and yet the ones all around it might only be 1 metre. So it's obviously there are conditions that under which it prospers. I think it'd be good to, who is it that acts as a sort of an agency for the repository of all information that's gathered? Is that just left up to the ordinary individual, or does hope to take a lead in that?
Yeah, well, that's when I think the work that we do is specifically related to fire. So there's many other things that are important for the species that we might not necessarily be taking the lead on managing it. So that's where I see information like the iNaturalist, or as I mentioned before, the ALA. They're good places where you can document more information about the species and anyone can access them. They're very public knowledge. And from what I'm aware, anyone can sort of go in and update the information there. That obviously having associations with research papers, it makes the evidence a bit stronger, but also just, you know, like you say, people having the species in their backyard or they've been out in the bush and seen different things, that gives good ideas to people like us or to other researchers about what to consider and what to think about for the species. For example, I'm not from this area, so I haven't spent a lot of time out the bush here, and some of the other researchers that I know have spent a lot of time working with this species aren't from the area either. So the local knowledge of people that have experienced things over time is really valuable, and I think it's a good thing to note of where's the best place to put that information, and if there's a general place that people know about, maybe people can put in more kinds of information. But yeah, I don't know the best way to do that, unfortunately.
Any other questions?
I think I did see a question in the chat from Louise, and she was just asking about the volunteer opportunities and whether people can participate in one day or to participate in all the days. So I just put on there some of the days that were available, but yes, you definitely don't have to participate in Tuesday to Friday. I appreciate that people have other commitments and work and all of those other things. So if people are available to just come for one day, that would also be really helpful. And it's a great way to get out and spend a bit of time in the bush if people have that kind of flexibility. If someone's really interested to be involved and they can't participate in a whole day, but they might be able to come for half a day, say in the morning before lunch or in an afternoon after lunch, then there's also a bit of flexibility there. People can contact me and we can work out the best arrangement.
Looks like Peter dropped out there for a moment.
I'm back again.
Irina, I'm just wondering about the next year. You're doing some follow-up monitoring in 6 months, is that right?
Yeah, so we're going out now. This will be the pre-burn monitoring. The burn won't go ahead until, sort of late autumn next year, and then 6 months after that burn will come back. So ideally, if people were available to come back and do monitoring in this post 6 months, that would be good too. And if anyone comes out to do this pre-burn monitoring and they want to be involved in the post-burn monitoring, they would be more than welcome when that opportunity comes around as well. And I think it's quite good in that continuation of a project to be able to be involved in both ends and to be able to see the response post fire themselves going out in the field. So that will be an opportunity that I'd like to provide to anyone that wants it as well.
Right, any other questions? We have a few minutes.
Just having a look through the chat to see if I can see any more questions.
I wonder if it set up a flora and fauna team for the Grevillea, because I think if there was a place where people could follow the various bits of information that come to light, they'd be more interested in the plant, because it is a beautiful plant. And I'm thinking out loud here, I'm sorry about that. It always normally leads me to trouble, but maybe we could talk about a place where accessed by people who might like to follow some of the progress that's been made. Anyone have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I don't know the best example there, but I think it would be good to have some sort of a collaborative interaction, maybe something between the department and friends groups such as the field naturalists or kin groups like that are interested and what's the best way to do that. It's work in progress, I suppose, but I think it's really good for events like this, like you say, to get the species more well known, because it might be people might just walk through and not even notice it, or have never even heard of Enfield Grevillea and don't know anything about it. But it is quite an attractive plant once you start to notice it and start to notice that it's quite prominent in where it is located in the bush.
Yeah.
Quite distinctive as well.
Yeah, I wondered, Michelle Butler, I wondered about Swift hosting a page that for interest, so people can go to it and post anecdotal sightings, their own citizen science observations, photos. I'll talk to Swift. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definite possibility. It would be very easy to set up the page, and Ian's fantastic in helping that. Like, there's lots of pages on individual species, so that would be a really good one to showcase, I reckon.
All right. Good.
Yeah, it sounds like a good first step.
Yeah.
So is there anyone that might have missed, that might have posted something in the chat that I might have missed and they wanted to talk about, or any new questions that come to mind?
Yeah, Irina, just Cherie and I were just talking about whether you've had any discussions with the Ballarat Botanic Gardens in terms of seed collection or cuttings and showcasing it, because Botanic Gardens provide a fantastic opportunity to really protect species into the future as well.
Yeah, so I haven't really spoken to them much at all, but that's a good point. It's always good to collaborate with new people and to get their perspective. So, do you know if they have the species at the moment, or whether they would put the species in their collection? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I'm thinking more they might put the species in their collection, but it's something we could follow up with them for sure.
Yeah, because I don't know how much. I think Peter mentioned that someone took a cutting and planted it, but I don't know how successful it is to grow it in those circumstances. Whether that was just a luck of the draw, or whether it's quite easy and that's something they could do. But yeah, I like the sound of it.
All right. Anyone who's tuned in and wants to participate, Irina's left her contact details, so make direct contact with her if you want to meet with her on site and be involved in that, in the surveying. That'd be great.
Yeah, and in any of the documents that I mentioned in the report, if anyone wants to, I can send them copies of it, or they can just search for it on the internet if they want to do some nice, thorough, in-depth reading.
Yeah, thanks, Shirley. That's great. All right, well, look, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Irina, for presenting. It's a great, good news story to bring to prominence a species that's, largely been overlooked. So it's great to have this focus, and even though it's from a fire perspective, it'll sort of act as a bit of a springboard for a lot of other interest among a lot of people who love the plant. So people make contact with Irina. Thank you very much, Irina, and thank you all for attending. Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Good. Right.
Thanks, Irina. Thanks, Peter, and thanks, everybody.
Yep. Thanks, Cherie. Yep.